Okay, I believe we can start. We have quorum. It's always a pleasure to see everybody come back to this webinars, and we had one last week which went very well, and now we are doing another one this week. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Brenzel Kaimba. As you can see from the title, today we really want to dig deep into post-remediation, post-vulnerability assessment strategies. So you're done with your vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. Now what? What do you need to focus on as an individual and also as an organization? So before we begin, I'll give you a brief introduction of who I am and who is hosting this webinar. So again, my name is Brenzel Kaimba. It's my pleasure to host you. I'm the program lead at Africa Cyber Immersion Center. And Africa Cyber Immersion Center is a training and research center that's based here in Nairobi. And its key goal is to engage, educate, and empower organizations and also individuals to enhance their skills, be it technical skills or even soft skills. So we run quite a number of trainings here that you are all welcome for. And for today, we'll have a very, very interesting speaker. And his name is Joseph Madenge. So Joseph Madenge is the Chief Operating Officer at Seriano Limited. And he has quite a number of years of experience, over 10 years of experience to be exact, in senior leadership roles, as well as hands-on and also frontline experience in managing and implementing security within various organizations. So some of his specialties include managing and running cybersecurity or security operations centers, running managed services for various for clients in various industries, banking, manufacturing, and many others. He's also an expert in forensics, business continuity, and he has a passion for enterprise security. Some of the roles that he's played before his current role, he was Chief Information Security Officer at Airtel Africa, and he was also a Senior Manager at Equity Bank, and he also has worked at World Bank. So with that, I know you're waiting to hear from him and not myself. So I'll welcome Joseph. Joseph, welcome.
Thank you, Brenzel. I really appreciate that very warm welcome.
Okay, thank you.
Greetings, everyone. I see we have quite a number of people who have logged in. Just by a show of hands, and maybe Brenzel, you can let me know. I hope I'm clear enough that everyone can hear me.
Yes.
Great. Excellent. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, to come and speak to you about an item that I believe is very relevant in this day and age, when we are continuously under the gun to advise the enterprise of the state of security of the systems that we are given either to administrate, to govern, to lead, to be actively engaged in them, consistently informing the business what is that realistic state of the environment is a key component. And I'll take some time to walk you through quite a number of strategies that over the years I have employed with some success in maintaining a certain level of stability as well as continuity in terms of managing this pen test activity. It is a hot topic. Most regulators, internal auditors, and so on and so forth will consistently ask for the last pen test that your organization ran, so as to make a decision in terms of where you are. I'll even go a step further, where nowadays in terms of engaging with a new third-party services provider, you as the services provider, or you who is looking to bring in somebody else, there is a request or requirement that you share what is the state of the last pen test as a way to articulate whether or not you are actively managing and understanding the risk of your organization, the risk of the systems that you're running, as well as you're actively going through the process. It's just going to be a few slides to be able to walk through in terms of explaining this, but I really do hope that we'll share information that will be relevant to your day-to-day. In terms of contents, in terms of what we shall step to, we'll begin, of course, by high-level look at what is the purpose of a vulnerability assessment penetration test, or as very commonly referred to as a VAPT. Keeping in mind that even as you define what that purpose is, there are certain limitations that come in doing the pen test. It's not necessarily a wide open checkbook, if you will, unlimited amount of time to be able to do it, and that most certainly impacts the quality of how you're able to do it. So I hope to spend some time to be able to give you a highlight or to mention some of the limitations that you may already have experienced as you went through the process of going through a pen test. Then comes the meat of our discussion, which is, here's the report. The assessor has been insight in your environment for the last 2 months, 3 months, 1 month, 2 weeks. They have concluded and prepared the report. That report has been presented to the IT team, to the risk team, to the audit team, or maybe even to the management team. Here's the report. So what next? How do we go about addressing these issues? And what is the right approach to be able to be effective in doing so? Keeping in mind, and I'll emphasize this point quite often, that what may be a vulnerability today, 6 months from now, may not matter whatsoever, even if you do spend quite a bit of time in addressing that. Which talks very importantly towards a plan of remediation. Have a strategy, a tactical approach on what you're fixing first, what you're fixing later, what may require capital expenditure, what's commonly referred to as a CapEx, what can be done in terms of a day-to-day. What are those things that you can do quickly to show management that you're progressing on, that you're actually addressing the issues that were identified by the auditor and that we are effectively doing them. And then the last part, which is always the measure, is execution. If you cannot get this done, if your PT report comes and sits on a shelf somewhere and gathers dust, for you to dust it off and do the exercise again next year, 2 years from now with the same issues showing up, obviously there is a concern there. Not so much that you are unable to address those issues, but there was no pragmatic look at how to fix those ones and to effectively execute across each and every of the item that was identified and you were able to address it. So we'll go right into it. So what's the purpose of a VAPT? Why do it? What exactly are you trying to do? In its most simplest definition, the purpose of conducting a vulnerability assessment or a penetration test is simply to identify the vulnerabilities of your currently deployed systems. A common statement that we make practicing in the industry is that there is no system that is 100% secure. It does not exist. Your safest computer is the one that you buy and bury. It's a completely useless computer. It's a completely useless server. So the fact that you have to go out and get it into the system and begin using it and making changes and so on and so forth, you will invariably incur new vulnerabilities. Those that are inherent into the system itself and new ones that you introduce throughout it. So the purpose of the VA and the PT simply is to identify system A, system B, network device C, database E, and so on and so forth. What are the weaknesses that are in those systems? It also ideally should give you a chance to test the effectiveness of your technical and process controls. Technical are those things that you have gone out and buy. Firewall, for example, would be a technical control. A database activity monitoring solution would be a technical control. An IDS, intrusion detection system, would be a technical control. These are systems that you buy to address a vulnerability inherent into a system, or one that you've introduced, and their technical nature help you address that vulnerability. Process controls, on the other hand, look at things that you do on a day-in, day-out basis, and whether or not those controls help reduce the vulnerability in your system. Maintenance of a healthy user access list in terms of granting access to those users who need it and granting them just enough access for them to do their day in, day out job. That is a process control. It's not necessarily technical in nature. It's one that you have consistently interrogate to make sure that it's accurate, that it's actually working. And the purpose of VAPT ideally is to come back and look at that process control and see, have we defined it and have we effectively put it in place? We'll talk about that throughout the presentation. During the VAPT, the purpose of that is to, number one, gain access to sensitive data. that is stored on your systems. Sensitive data could be personal identifiable information for your employees, personal identifiable information for your clients if you're a bank, or if you're a hospital, medical records. Any one of what could be defined as a sensitive data, and this tends to be a very interesting discussion. What exactly is a sensitive data for an organization? But from a pen tester perspective, you want to see if there are any controls whatsoever in terms of encryption, separation of the data, salting of the data. How easy is it for somebody to gain access to that sensitive data? Number two, I, as Joseph Mathenge, may be granted access into the system within my organization, and that access might not necessarily be a privileged user. I may not be a system administrator, I may not be a DBA, any one of those privileged activities that allows me to do quite a bit in the system. So as a pen tester or as a malicious actor, how easy is it to escalate my privileges? How easy is it to automatically, outrightly create a privileged user that has access into the system? Point number three is, can I just be a nuisance? Can I simply disable a critical system, a critical service? Can I launch a small-scale denial of service or a full-scale distributed denial of service that brings an entire bank system down, that brings an entire hospital system down? What is the capability of an external user or an internal user with malicious intent be able to disable a critical service? In pen testing, this tends to be very sensitive discussion. Do you actually want your pen tester to attempt to disable a critical service? And if they are successful, is that successful? I wearing a hacker hat, I wearing a pen tester hat, of course, I succeeded. That's what I set out to do. But if I am wearing the hat of a senior management, as the CEO of Siriano, as the CEO of any bank, of any organization, absolutely not. I do not want the production systems to go down because that's how I'm servicing my clients. So that tends to be a very interesting discussion, and we touch on that a little bit in terms of methodology. Finally, can I execute a fraud? Ultimately, the days have passed us when people did hacks into the systems simply for bragging rights. Now it's an enterprise. Now it's an activity for I to get access into the system and redirect funds that are supposed to be paid to this client to another account which I have access to, and I can withdraw those funds to actually execute fraud. So a pen tester, do I have the ability of going way past the controls of a maker and a check? Can I make changes to certain static data, account numbers, mobile numbers, and cause that to create a problem? Ultimately, you want to identify your vulnerabilities. You want to understand your weaknesses. If you understand your weaknesses, you can then prioritize your defense. You can then be able to either step up your process controls, buy and implement new technical controls, buy a technical control that meets the asset that you're trying to protect, and so on and so forth. Understanding your weaknesses helps you prioritize whatever your defenses are. So let's take a few minutes and understand limitation of VAPT. As I mentioned before, it is never a perfect system. It is never wide open for anyone to do whatever it is that they want to do. Most importantly, I feel that this is most relevant in any time that you do a PT, is that it's a snapshot in time. Today is the 4th day of June 2020. If we were to kick off a pen test of your organization today and run that pen test for the next 4 weeks, the report that comes out in July will simply state the vulnerabilities that were in your systems during the month of June of 2020. You will agree with me that in September of 2020, in November of 2020, in January of 2021, that may have changed. You may have a new service that has gone live. You may have replaced your underlying host system. You may have changed how you connect to a cloud service provider. It does not address where you'll be 6 months from now. So a PT is purely a snapshot in time. It's telling you the storyline right now where we are. This is an important point when you're describing it to senior management. Just because senior management invest in you doing a PT now doesn't mean that in December that the systems are still secure. Changes have occurred, and it's important to convey that to them, that a PT, yes, will tell us where we are right now, but it's a snapshot in time. Point number 2 is that there's restrictions. I don't know of any organization that has a wide open checkbook that will allow a pen tester to come and do a pen test across all systems, all endpoints, all laptops, all servers, all cloud points, all connections to third-party services. Absolutely not. So that restriction now creates an interesting scenario. Let's say you have 4 services providers, and in your pen test you only focus on 2. An attacker could focus on the other 2 and get in by exploiting a vulnerability in those ones. So you must keep that in mind in terms of remediation. What may be true of system A and B is probably true of all systems in your environment. Your remediation must hit all the systems. 3, we have to think about the methodology. I already touched on this earlier on in terms of the approach and the impact. For example, if you're going to do a pen test that has a denial of service component in it, or whether it's just simply testing, on when you're testing whether or not your system is vulnerable to a fraud, and whether or not the tester will attempt to transfer money from your account to another account, the capability of the methodology comes into play. What tools are they using? Are they using 1 of 5 tools? Are these tools open source tools, or are they commercial tools? And does it matter whether they're using open tools or commercial tools? I submit to you that it doesn't matter. What is important are bullet points 2 and 3, which is the technical skills of the tester. How good are they? Are they simply point and click on the tool? Or do they have the ability of sitting behind a machine and writing code and crafting a packet and doing something that extends the capability of the tool or tunes the tool such that it's able to very effectively identify a vulnerability and find an exploit that can take advantage of that vulnerability and grant access, achieve the objective of that particular vulnerability. And then the last part of it is tenacity. Tenacity, in a simple word, is just your willingness to try and fail and try again and fail and try again and fail again. Your effective pen tester is one who is dogged in their attack, is one who will continuously test the system to see whether or not this that they tried to do did not fail because I used the wrong tool, the wrong packet, the wrong approach, or what it was. And then time allowed to conduct the assessment. Again, you don't have unlimited amount of time. You don't want an external vendor continuously poking inside your system, or even your internal players, internal IT security team continuously poking on production systems. So you narrow the time which is allowed to conduct the assessment, which in itself will limit the quality of the assessment that's done and the data that comes out of it. So we have talked quite a bit in terms of the limitations. We now start getting into the strategies that we are going to be looking at. Number 1, I broke this apart into 2 components, the vulnerability VA side of it and the PT of it, as you can see in the slide. The vulnerability assessment should be a continuous activity, not one time, but one that you potentially do continuously. Once a month, once a quarter, semi-annually. How frequently can you effectively do a PT, a VA in your environment that will give you that continuous picture of what is going to look like in your environment? I argue that it's better if it's conducted in-house on somebody who understands your environment, who understands the nature of your system, who understands when there was a change that went into a certain production system, and is able to know where there could be new vulnerabilities introduced that he or she needs to go and assess. However, it of course may be expensive or unrealistic to have somebody full-time hired to be conducting VAs. So can you engage a long-term partner, one who understands your environment and can come in on agreed upon schedule to conduct the assessments continuously? It's a technical assessment done using a myriad of tools, targeting different systems, but is able to, he or she, they are continuously able to give you new information that will allow your operations team, even as they continue maintaining the health of the systems, will be able to continuously do it. So separate the VA component as a separate activity and do it on a certain regular schedule as your environment can allow. Your PT, however, should be done at least once a year, or as they commonly say, anytime there's a major change in your system, which means if you moved from data center A to data center B, and even if you conducted the PT in January, and this is July, new 6 months of the year, new data center, do another PT if you can afford it, if you're able to do it, if you have the internal resource or an existing long-term external partner who has an engagement with you that can come in and do it without necessarily charging you anything extra to be able to do it. It is so very important to use experienced and capable external resources to do it. The PT component ideally should not be done by somebody internal because they may not go after the systems with a fresh eye. It's so very important that not just anyone off the street, but somebody who has credentials, has the experience doing it, has a history of doing it. Another important point that I don't specify this is that you're exposing the weaknesses of your systems, which means if you're not engaging somebody who is focused on the craft, they may have another agenda. They may have another agenda of understanding your information and using that to exploit you in a malicious way. So it's so very important that you understand who is this tester, where has he or she done a test before, can they be trusted? If I needed to find them, I can be able to find them. Who exactly is this person? And how well will they stand behind their report? We will talk about later on certain errors or omissions that a pen tester can do. An experienced and capable pen tester recognizes that there are certain assumptions that they make, which may be wrong. And it's important for you to continue the partnership and say, okay, I was wrong on that one. I come back and make the correction or clarification on this point. Very clearly define the objectives that you want to achieve in the pen test. Do we want simply to find weaknesses in the system? Do we want to find our use of legacy systems? Do we want to find presence of exploitable code in an application that we have recently rolled out? What exactly are you trying to achieve? And detailed out those objectives. It helps guide and contain the pen tester within a certain realm around which they conduct the assessment, around which they do theirs. So defined objectives and the reporting around those objectives help, of course, in telling the story back to senior management because it comes in. Your pen tester should not be using one tool. There should be a variety of tools. Different ones that test databases, that test network devices, that test cloud services, web applications, different tools with different capabilities. Like I said, mix and match. Open source tools versus commercial tools. It doesn't really matter, but you want to see that there is a wide scope of tools that are being utilized to do it. And then, of course, be very wary of impact on production system. A simple scan may not bring down the system, but it may cause it to perform in less than desired rate. That it may not deliver the expected information to the end user, both internal and external. So what's the likely impact of a pen test? In some organizations, they choose to do the pen test after business hours, nights, weekends. In some organizations are okay doing it during production system. You have more people in the environment, more people who are looking at the system to see what's going on with it. That is absolutely fine. So here we are. The test is done. Here's the report. What should we do? It is complete. It is all the way done, printed nicely in color, showing your high, medium, and low, and critical, and so on and so forth. So what? What should I do with this report? The first part that I have to always emphasize is that it's a technical report. Most people are not accustomed to reading or consuming technical reports. It's not something that you can sit and read in one sitting or two sittings. You have to consume it in doses. You have to consume it in bits and pieces for it to be most effective. So have no expectation that the technical report will come out today, and by next week, Thursday, you have completed reading through the entire report. It's just not practical. You need to read a section that talks about web applications, a section that talks about DBs, something that talks about process controls. It needs to be broken down to understand what does it tell, and in a way that I'm able to consume it. And then also, your pen tester, particularly if it's an external pen tester, may not understand the correlation of the systems, may have rated something as a medium, but when you look at the systems that he's talking about, to you, that should be a high, that should be a critical, because of how those two systems interact. So it's important that you appreciate it needs to be done in doses and broken down into pieces. Which brings us to the next point, which is around distribution of the report of those accountable to the target systems. Are you going to sit there and read it by yourself? Are you all going to go into one room on a Friday afternoon with copious amounts of Coke or coffee, pizza, and start reading the report? What exactly will be your approach in reading it? You need to distribute it across all the players. System administrators need to address their system, DBAs on databases. If you have application developers, or I'll expand that to say application owners, the ones who actually own the system and how it effectively works. Also, you may have a system that is managed and supported by somebody externally. So you may need to carve out the section that talks about their systems and give them to consume that part of it. So distribute the report to those accountable of the target system. Break it down and make sure that it has been sent out to whoever needs to consume it, to make sure that A, they consume it in the doses that we talked about, and B, they bring their best foot. They don't get caught up in details to do with network devices if their focus is on the web application or the mobile application. Let it be very specific to who it is. Which is why it's important to create categories around how to navigate the report itself. To break it down to what requires a configuration change, what requires an upgrade, what requires a patch, what requires a replacement of a legacy system, so on and so forth. You need certain categories that make sense to help you navigate through the report and help you formulate the plan around which you're going to be able to remediate the system. It's also impeccably important that you validate the findings of what the assessor put together in the report itself. As mentioned before, the assessor may very well make errors in the tools that they used, in the approach that they did, in the way that they crafted their attack on your systems, the assessment on your system. It is possible that they may have made an error in the reporting itself, in the finding itself. You need to find it. And you need to find it before you send it up the food chain. As you're distributing it among stakeholders, as talked about in the previous slide, they will help you identify those errors. But before you send it up the food chain to everyone else, you need to identify those errors and be able to address them such that when it comes up in senior management meeting, you're able to talk through it. Assessors may also inadvertently omit something without paying attention to what they were doing. Not that they intended to do so, but it happens. Your role is to validate and find those errors and to find areas where they made conclusions based on information that they did not fully have. Now, this always brings a very interesting discussion. If you have a pen tester who comes and spends a month in your organization, and he or she come back and submit to you a report that has 3 pages with everything showing green, you may question their value. So pen testers will tend to go into an environment with a sole intent to make sure that they find something and they include in their report because they may feel that that is what shows their value in the way they did it. However, if we define the scope correctly, if we define the objectives well, and we appreciate the different tools, it is possible that your system at this point in time may have minimal vulnerabilities in the environment. You as an organization have done well in managing that, and that's a good thing. So look out for conclusions based on inadequate information. Look out for conclusions that may be driven by the pen tester intending to deliver value, but it doesn't necessarily help you do anything with the information that they share. Find areas that they call out that should have had mitigating controls that show up. They call out and say that this database does not record log activity of user. Well, you have a DAM, database activity monitoring tool. The DAM's tool is to record what any user does when they connect into the system. Is it possible that they completely missed out on the DAM? Absolutely. So find areas, system, application, so on and so forth, areas that you know you had a weakness, you had put some type of a control, virtual patching. I already mentioned the presence of a dam, segregation of the environment, something that should have mitigated the control, and see if that was tested. This is now the question to your pen tester. This control was here, you marked it as missing, or you marked it as incapable. Did you test this? If the answer is yes, that shows a remediation area that you need to go back and address. If the answer is no, then of course, let's work on your end. They need to go back and test and see if it still comes up with the same things. The ratings tend to be driven by the assessor based on one, the weakness, vulnerability they found in the system, what the tool tells them, what their knowledge is. They use that to do a critical, high, medium, or low type of rating. Does that tally with the organization? Does it tally with the impact to the business if that particular vulnerability was exploited? This is very important. So ask the question to the pen tester. Okay, you rated this as a critical. Why? You rated this as a high. Why? And because you understand the end asset, you understand the end application, you're able to come to an agreement as to whether or not that was correctly rated. Another point that creates a lot of contention is around this. You want to reduce the number of criticals to highs, the number of highs to a medium, simply because you're able to show to senior management that you're not running a vulnerable environment. But you really must be able to identify those systems that are critically vulnerable to an existing exploit out there that you have not yet either identified, you haven't patched, or for whatever other reason, still brings a significant risk to the organization. Remember, taking risk to senior management, knowledge of risk is actually a good thing, because now you're able to put into play the controls to fix those risks. You're now able to now practice as a security information practitioner in securing the state of the environment, the state of the systems that are being used in that environment. Finally, we now move on to the remediation side of things. A commonly said phrase, failing to plan is a plan to fail, is something that I find to be very interesting. That you did not have a strategy around how you consume the report, on how you distribute it, on how the players are. You are putting yourself with a huge amount of remediation that you need to do, and the lack of the adequate tools to be able to address it. So you need to categorize your findings. We already talked about this being potentially technical findings, as well as process and procedure. We'll come to that shortly. On your technical findings, we are talking about situations that indicate a system was misconfigured. A firewall, a router, a switch was not correctly configured and is still running, for example, with a default password. That a device was placed within the correct VLAN, but is not sitting behind a list of firewall rules to make sure that it's segregated like all the other systems in production. Any other one or dozen different type of system misconfiguration, which many a times point to human error, not intentional. These systems tend to be dynamic. As you're flying through them to try to bring them live, to bring them into production, the possibility of having a system misconfiguration is very high. Attackers love this. The majority of exploits that we have seen in many places is where they take advantage of a system that was simply misconfigured. Technical findings may also point to areas that require a patch. Most common assessments will have a huge amount of systems that are listed out, requires patch, requires patch, requires patch. And some of that patch classification, I tend to find it a bit misleading. Patching may actually indicate a need to upgrade, which I mentioned in the next bullet point. Something qualified, classified as a patch may actually point to require the replacement of use of a legacy system. So qualify strictly those ones that are patches, and that the OEM, the vendor of the system, has released a patch to fix that particular vulnerability, as the ones that require a patch. System misconfigurations is not patching per se. A patch, in essence, is that you're running a certain change on the system itself that will fix whatever that weakness that has been identified. I highlighted required capital expenditure, CapEx commonly referred to, as an item that tends to create quite a bit of a hindrance. Going back to the business to tell them that we need to spend an additional 10, 15, 20, $100,000 so as to address all these issues that came up in the last pen test tends to be a contentious issue. It is a business. The business is not going to willy-nilly spend money just to fix systems, even though that they know it's important. It is fantastic when you go back to the business and show them, look, this requires system configuration. We will work on that. This require patches. I can download them from the OEM, no problem. These ones require CapEx, and we can plan for them over the next 6, 8, 1, even 2 years. Process and procedural changes, while in essence may not necessarily require cost, require a change in behavior, in the way people come into the system. So there's the policy definition part of it, and then there's the implementation of that policy and put into practice into what people do on a day in, day out basis. And then may require a technical solution. I separated this one from the others. However, I should have highlighted that this one potentially also requires CapEx. If you need to go out and buy a data loss prevention, a DLP solution, you need to go out and buy an encryption tool. This is a budget item that perhaps was not in your IT strategic plan, and you need to now come up with it. So your remediation needs to take into account that implementation of a technical solution more than likely would require CapEx, and you need to plan around it. We now get to the fun part, which is the execution, the fixing of this long list of items. We have our plan, we have identified what is broken, we have identified the approach, we know what will require configuration change. It's time to jump into it. A majority of the pen test reports that I've seen always begin by stating focus on critical and high rated findings. It sounds mundane, but it's accurate. Critical and high rated findings are obviously the highest risk to the organization. You must put in place a control around this one. You must put in place a way to make sure that indeed you're not exposed to what may be coming in from something that's already been identified. If you remember the WannaCry worm recently, and it took advantage of existing patches that should have been fixed, whoever was responsible for those systems should have planned for and executed around fixing that as a critical or a high-rated finding, depending on the nature of the system that was exposed. Focus on those controls that were supposed to be in place. This tends to be an item of great annoyance to senior management. If this was supposed to be in place and we spent money to buy it, why haven't you fixed it? So that should be your first part of it. How did this control break down? Did we not size it correctly? Did we not put it in place correctly? Where exactly did we miss the bus on it? This one should be one that you attack very, very quickly, because the control was already in place. The CapEx has already been spent on it. It should have been actively in place. There is a breakdown somewhere operationally that needs to be addressed, focused, and hit on that. Execute on those that require configuration changes. I say this and I say it in italics, that it tends to have the lowest impact, because it's time somebody sitting behind a router, a switch, a firewall, and making certain configuration change, hardening a certain system. It tends to have low impact on the system running of itself, particularly if it's one that deviated from your minimum baseline standard. Ideally, it should have already been in place. Put an asterisk against that. It is potential that configuration change could break upstream another system, so you need to plan and test around it. You need to figure out, can I do this now? And what's it likely to do? And how do I get my way out of it in case it breaks something else to it? You need to plan around it so as to make sure that that is addressed effectively. I already mentioned on policy, process, and procedures. This tends to be straightforward, the documentation part of it. So start. We have been informed that we need to come up with a new policy around BYOD, so create it. That we need to improve our backup and recovery procedure to include a testing component, so include that as a documentation. That our data retention policy doesn't meet what the regulator states, so include that in terms of the policy. That our information security policy was crafted 4 years ago, and it's supposed to be updated every year. So go ahead and update it. That, in theory, is an easy, straightforward type of activity. I say attack it, put it in place in terms of the policy itself. Of course, updating a policy always brings the question, who will write the policy? The owner of the policy procedure ideally should be the one who is the author of that document itself. Author meaning they may not be the one who sits behind the keyboard and crafts it, but they need to make sure that it gets done. These policies are so many of them out there. You can go online and download full policy documents and just spend some time in customizing them for your organization. So policy documentation should not be that complicated. It should be one that you intentionally focus and execute on it without having to craft it from scratch. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can actually get it from somewhere else. So go ahead and grab it, put it in place. So carefully consider in terms of the procedural change on that. On the technical implementation, consider impact to business as you remediate. Here's a 4-step on how you should approach it. Number 1, test where possible before implementing the fix. If you have a test environment, kudos to you. Go ahead and test it in your test environment. I'll submit to you that most organizations do not have a broad enough test environment that all your production systems are existing in a test environment that will allow you to do it in test. Therefore, get creative. Do you have a development environment where before you roll out into production, your dev environment is where you test new versions of the applications, new functions of the application? Do you have a dev environment around which you have some level of control of the systems? That should be the environment on which you test that first before you push it out into production. Again, you may not have a dev environment for all your systems. So then what's your next option? You may have a DR, active DR that is easy and quick to fall into, to fail over in case of a risk, or a passive DR where your backups normally go to. You can repurpose that DR environment as the environment where you test your fixes fast on to see how will it react to system, what will it break, and that has no impact on production. I can see the question coming in that what if in the process of testing it in DR, it breaks DR and production goes down, and now you have a DR that's down and production that's down. That's an absolutely valid concern, but you have to test it and see what happens if indeed it will break the production and that particular environment. If it does, you roll back, which is what would happen if you needed to apply directly onto production. If you don't have anywhere where you can test this, have a very robust rollback plan documented that you can execute. Rollback can be as simple as a backup, one that you know you can restore within a very short amount of time. So if you apply the fix to that production environment or DR test environment, it breaks down, you roll back to where it was working positively. At least now you have a storyline to tell that we tried this, it's not working, we are still testing around it in case the question comes in from senior management. Finally, when do you apply this? You need to schedule it and do it during a maintenance window. Too many environments with the pressure of a pen test and the results of the pen test and the result of an audit will quickly go in to start fixing, particularly those critical and high. I still argue that everything that does in production must be done during a maintenance window. There must be a clear reason why you touch anything in production. That should only be done during the maintenance window in 99.99% of the time. Minimize what you do in production. Make production a live wire. If you touch it, get electrocuted. It needs to be that sanctified to make sure that it doesn't break. We already talked about the technical solution. I won't spend too much time on that. So we come into now the discussion to do with CapEx. We have all the systems that we need potentially to upgrade, that potentially we need to replace. We are running 2007, Windows 2007, which is no longer supported. We have ATMs that are still running on XP, We need to implement a technical solution. How should we do this? All of these things are budget items and potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars to get them done. We are a small size company that is just making it day to day. How do we be able to do this? Here's the order which I suggest that you go through. Begin first with those systems that require an upgrade. The upgrade of a system that may require CapEx may require the least amount of cost on that. You may actually be able to discuss and agree with your OEM, your original equipment manufacturer, creator of the system, on how they can upgrade it with a minimal cost to you. So begin with those ones. Those ones are an easier discussion. If you go price them, you'll find that potentially those ones that require upgrade and the CapEx for those ones that require upgrade tends to be the smallest. So start with those ones. Go and ask for supplementary budget if you don't already have it in your budget to upgrade the following systems that came out to a pen test. Note my words. I like sticking the pen test report back onto management's shoulders because it's hard for them to argue back with you. So the following systems that were picked out by a pen tester require upgrade. So I need budget of X amount to upgrade the following systems. It is less than the ones that require legacy system. We come into the legacy systems discussion. Here you're arguing that, look, these legacy systems are no longer supported. They don't fit where the business is going. They don't fit what we are doing. So we should plan to put these ones. And look, they came up in the audit report. They came up in the pen test report. And allow those ones to now be the first ones that you put in place. Now, the technical solutions, with some debate, should be the last ones that you put in place. And I say that because it's so important that you find a way to sweat the assets that you currently have. It's so important to maximize and show I have no other options here, which is why I'm coming to buy a brand new firewall, why I'm coming to put in place a whole new encryption system, why our current certification management is not very effective. This is the reason why we are doing this. People tend to go after the technical solutions first. People tend to buy those solutions first. Whereas you can mature your way into it. You can make the argument that, look, we have the following 5 technical solutions that we need to do. Let's do them over the next 3 years. In year 1, we'll do this one and this one. Year 2, we'll do this one. Year 3, we'll do this one. And it really does allow management to see that you're paying attention to what the organization is doing, that you're paying attention on how you're progressing, that you actually understand the reality of your environment and what needs to happen with it. And then now on the policy and procedure, like I mentioned, this one tends to have a 2-step to it. The first part is the documentation of the new policy or procedure. The second part is the installation of that new policy or procedure. A new policy, which is thou shalt not type of document, needs to be disseminated to the whole organization to make sure they understand. You need to find a way to make sure that they review. Policy documents are boring to read. They are not exciting. There's nothing sexy about them. So no one really wants to spend time reading through policy document. Yet it's important that you make sure that you push it out. Make sure people understand that a violation of policy is in violation of A, B, and C. So you need time to put that in place. A change in procedure that may impact your operational team, your technical team, system administrators, database administrators, so on and so forth. It needs time to put in place. So you need to plan. Give yourself 3-6 months to install it and a way to test to make sure that it's effectively being put in place, that all the items within it are done correctly, that you're able to do exactly what you need to achieve from that policy or procedure document. That brings me to my very last slide. I'll hand it back to Bransil and open it up if we have time for any questions that the team may have. Over to you, Bransil.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Joseph, for that insightful presentation. And at this point, I'll also just ask if there are any questions from the audience. You can just post them on the Q&A tab. But on my part, I'm really grateful for the insights that you've shared. And I agree with what you said, especially the failing to plan is planning to fail. So I'll just dig into some of the questions that I already had. So these are 3 questions to be exact. Then I'll also ask some of the questions from the Q&A tab. So you've talked about the key strategies during and also after a VAPT, and you've also touched on the remediation and the different steps that are needed. And I think you have that unique advantage of having experience both as a consumer of VAPT and also now as a vendor of VAPT. So the question is, what are some of the what are some of the questions that you'd ask someone, an IT or an organization to ask a vendor before even the engagement, so that they get value from this whole process? Because as you've mentioned, sometimes a vendor would come in to exploit just to show that they can actually exploit. So what can you advise an organization that wants to do a pen test? The question they can ask before conducting a pen test.
Very good. Many a times when we engage vendors, we are hoping that they are going to bring in expertise that we don't already have in-house. It's an opportunity for you to learn something new. It is a double-edged sword, because you also have to be careful of the person that you're asking the question, whether or not they know exactly what they're advising you. So in yourself, and I'll go back to where I mentioned this early on, understand first of all, what are the objectives of this assessment? Are we doing an assessment so as to meet a regulatory requirement? Are we doing it because the internal policy mandates that us to do it? What exactly are those objectives? Having defined the objectives, your vendor should now come and add to that. They should now give you an idea that you do not already have, but you're not the proverbial ship being led to the slaughterhouse, but rather a ship that's been led to cleaner, fresher water to drink. So understand, where am I starting and where am I going? Even though you may not have a technical background, you want to have a very high level understanding of what you want to achieve from such an assessment. And then what's the scope of the assessment? Do you want him to come and poke around on all systems? Do you want him to focus on certain critical system? What exactly do you really want him to focus? What is that scope? You define your scope. And then, of course, you're asking the vendor, tell me something I don't already know. What are other people who are offering services through Azure, through AWS, the Amazon Web Services, through any one of these ones? How are they doing pen test for the environments? What are they looking for? What's that scope? What exactly is it? So you're coming in with some level of knowledge. It doesn't need to be technical, but you understand what you need to achieve, and you're looking for the vendor to add to what you don't already know, not to guide you straight out from something that you don't know.
Okay. And the other question would be, now you're done with the pen test, and I know you've touched on this. So you have your findings and you have your recommendations. You've prioritized what's critical, what needs to be fixed. Now, a few weeks, a few months. So how do you communicate these findings to management or to the board, so that it's easier for them to, as you've said, some of these things require money, investments. So how do you communicate these findings so that they understand the importance and also hopefully approve budgets?
It's unbelievably important that when you walk into that room of senior management or members of the board, whether they are all of them or it's just a committee, it's unbelievably important for you to recognize that you're potentially dealing with a non-technical audience. So any technical terms that you have in your discussion need to be thrown out. Now, this is the chicken and egg scenario. How do you convey a technical matter to a non-technical audience? Now, you have to remember they're the ones who are signing the check. If they do not understand, they're not going to sign the check. So it's important that you qualify it without being patronizing, without showing off your knowledge, but you qualify what it is that you're asking from the context of the business. In what direction is the business going? If we are on the path of a digital transformation, What are those priority digital transformation activities? What systems, capabilities are we looking to offer to our clients? And here are the vulnerabilities that will prevent us from achieving that goal. Your discussion with that team needs to be in that context. You as a technical person need to talk technical in business terms to a business audience. Minimize technical terms, put it in context of the business itself. You're in insurance, you're in manufacturing, you're in healthcare, you're in banking. Put it in that context. Don't come and say that we found 15,000 vulnerabilities, and for us to fix the 15 vulnerabilities, we need to, no, they don't care. You will see them glaze over within 10 minutes, and you will see them continuously lose respect for you. But if you put it in context of the business, and particularly the direction which you're going into, then it is easier to get their buy-in, to get them to consume it. And then also in piecemeal. Technical document, give it to them in piecemeal. I want to present this in 4 meetings. Meeting 1, we'll talk about all the criticals. In meeting 2, we'll do medium and low. And on the last meeting, we'll break it down such that you give them chance to consume and appreciate what it is that you're sharing with them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I can see a question from Jay. He says, how do you guarantee security of end user devices when working from home? Any best practices around that? Given that we are...
if you think, indeed, if you think about what this whole pandemic has forced us to do is to work remotely. And we were already working remotely. Most people have their emails available to them on their phones or tablets or laptops. Access to that email in some debate is working from home, is working remotely. There are certain applications, depending on the nature of what you do, that were already put in your handheld device and you are granted. This is before the pandemic. This was our reality before we got to this stage in life. Just because now we are majority working from home, the practices or the lack thereof practices that you had on those devices now show up. Are you able to account for everything that Joseph Madenge does when he dials in from home? What system does he connect to? What activity does he do? What files does he touch? What does he change? What does he view? If you have the ability of auditability, tracking what somebody is doing at the end user, then your concern about what device and how do you guarantee it reduces. Because now you're able to identify that this is Joseph Madenge who was connected. He normally logs in between 8:30 and 1 p.m., between 1 p.m. and midnight, between midnight and 4 a.m. You're able to account for their work practices and be able to identify when something is off, and keeping in sights your most critical data, most critical systems, that those ones are not getting manipulated in a malicious way.
Okay. I think the other question I can see from Jay is also, how can you tailor the penetration test to cater for a large environment and still be comprehensive enough to cover all the areas?
That's a very good question. Really focusing on the question that we said that no one has a wide open checkbook to do across 5,000, 10,000 devices, both endpoints and servers, and so on and so forth. You need to have enough knowledge of your environment and be able to qualify what is critical to the business. Hopefully the organization has gone through a business continuity management, business continuity planning activity. You have done your business impact analysis. You know what is critical to the business and what's not critical. If you have such a document in place, the BIA, business impact analysis, that should guide what you start with, because the ones that have the biggest impact on the system should be the ones that you start with. And then, because remember you're doing this in piecemeal, first set of PT will focus on those critical systems. The second set of PT, here I'm assuming you can do it twofold, beginning of the year and end of the year. You will do the first part of the year, focus on critical. Second part of the year, the less critical systems, and focus on those ones. So you need to divide and conquer your environment. You need to have understanding of what's critical in your environment. You need to start what's critical. You also need to focus on everything else. You need to recognize that while I may not address this system now, in the next round of PT, I need to address it. And even though I have finite dollars, I'll be able to do it within that context.
Okay. I can see a question from Charles. He's asking, what is a DR? I presume maybe it was mentioned. So this is a disaster recovery site. So I'll probably just answer it for him. This is your alternative site that should anything happen to your primary site, especially where you have all your critical systems, servers, this is the site that will be serving you for redundancy sake. The other question, my final question for you, Joseph, would be, so with COVID, again, the pandemic, most vendors have to operate remotely. So how do you see this playing out, especially with assessments, remediation within organizations? So previously, vendors had to go to organizations to conduct this. So how do you see this remote working? How do you see this working remotely, especially for vulnerability assessments and pen tests?
Sure. I'll answer it from the context of firewalls that I used to work with, Juniper. I suspect quite a number of you may be familiar with this. The Juniper firewalls, and maybe many others, but I'll use this as the example, have the concept of trust, semi-trust, and untrust. Trust obviously means those things that you know you have control over, that you can see. Trust from a network perspective would be your production environment, the one that's internal. Your semi-trust would be your user. They are not untrust internet, but they are semi-trust. We kind of know who they are. And then, like I said, the untrust is everyone else. Your vendors need to be qualified as semi-trust. Yes, you have done some homework to understand who they are, what they're coming to your environment to do, what access in your environment do they need. Mm-hmm. But you should not completely trust them. You should have very clear accountability, timelines, focus, scope, activities of what they are doing when they come into your environment. So whether they are physically there, just because they walked in and you said hi to them and you shared a cup of coffee before they started on their activity, doesn't mean that you should trust them. So what are you here today? If it's a health check maintenance activity, give me a breakdown of the activities you hope to achieve today in terms of perhaps a work card or something. It should be the same concept. When they're working and accessing you remotely, you have to have that understanding that we will grant you, vendor, access to environment between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. on Thursday so that I can be able to know what it is that you did while you came in. That semi-trust is, yes, I know you, but I want to see what you are doing. And if you do something that is not what you're supposed to be doing, I want to shorten the amount of time to be able to find it, simply because I have something to go back and review what exactly it is that you did that I allowed you to do.
Okay. Let me just read another one. So there are quite a number of comments and appreciation. I have learned a lot of new things here, says Charles. That was extremely insightful from Rita. And also Jay says it's extremely informative. So I think the audience is really, really enjoying what the knowledge that you're sharing. One question from Michael is that he says, please comment on red teaming and blue teaming exercises.
Excellent. The red team, blue team is a relatively new concept that's coming out. It is the idea that you have a team A that is focused on attempting to attack and exploit your environment, and blue team, whose work is to now play the defense, is to identify the malicious actor, try and identify what is the objective of the malicious actor, the red team activity, and to be able to thwart that. From a practical perspective, your security operations center, your security operations team are consistently in a blue team mode. They're consistently identifying threats from vulnerabilities of your systems or from user behavior that is not kosher, that's not normal. They're basically looking out for what activity is abnormal and preventing that. So red teaming they wear the hat of an attacker. They are trying to exploit certain systems. They do it within a controlled environment, controlled objective. The blue team doesn't necessarily know what are the objectives of the red team. However, they need to identify that malicious activity. They need to prevent it. They need to block it. They need to stop the red team from being able to succeed.
Okay. Okay. I think those are the main questions. I think the final one is from Thambi So Meshakai. Do you have worksheets which one can use to properly compile and plan for remediation? And just to comment on that, I think there's a webinar that we've scheduled again on the same, just how do you now go through that. But yes, I think we can even talk about this more in depth in a later webinar.
Just to add to that, if I may, Bransil?
Yes.
As part and parcel of what we mentioned in terms to you, Meshach, that is part and parcel of what we talked about in terms of understanding who is your provider for the pen test. One of the things that you hope they very strongly come out is on a remediation plan. They should be able to guide you on the approach of how to be able to remediate that. So you're looking for them to share with you these worksheets. You're looking for them to share with you a plan of sorts that you can be able to craft your remediation around. And if they not, that's a good point for you to evaluate and figure out whether or not this provider is very effective. But like Bransil said, yes, there are future webinars where we shall talk about this in depth and share to some extent some additional worksheets that you can be able to employ.
Okay, so the very final one, I can see so many more questions coming up, but let me just maybe Caleb, hi Caleb. Which vulnerability assessment and penetration testing methodology produces the best result? Is it on site or the one that's done remotely, from your experience?
Which attacker is most effective? The one who's in-house or outside? Okay, I say that in a bad joke. A pen test should combine both things. A pen test should have certain activity that is done remotely. Malicious actor may very well be sitting outside the organization, will take time to exploit a mobile application, a web application, your website, some other service, work their way into your environment, and then now go ahead and begin to exploit. That's one approach that an attacker may do. Another one, which is most common, is that the attacker is sitting in-house. And the attacker is sitting in-house because he has compromised somebody internally, suggested to them to bring a thumb drive and plug it in, and that thumb drive has a remote tool of sorts that infects that machine, calls back to the attacker, and so on and so forth. So you need a mix and match of both. You need to do certain amount of attack testing, pen testing externally. You also need to bring that in-house. They say that organizations tend to be tough on the outside but soft and chewy on the inside. So you want to mimic and be in an environment where just because your external firewall, next generation firewall with IDS that's protecting your environment does nothing once I get inside, you want to identify that weakness. And the only way you can do that is to do a pen test, assuming that somebody is sitting already inside the organization.
Okay, so thank you for that. I can see one comment from Keletso. I think she had sent out a question. I've not been able to see it, so kindly resend it, and we'll take it as the last question. But I can still read some of the comments from the group. So Mugambi says this was a great presentation, Joseph. We'll definitely invite you to bring into the perspective for. Yes, majority of you are asking about the recording. Yes, we'll record and we'll share the recording with you after this webinar. Keletso, if you can repost your question, we'll answer it. Oh, you've said you appreciate it and would you appreciate the slides? Yes, we'll share this after the session is done. So far, I cannot see any new questions that have been posted, but thank you so much, Joseph, for taking the time and also just preparing for this session. And you've shared quite a lot of insights, and we hope to have you again and maybe take up the next, do the next session where we are now talking about the remediation in depth, and also maybe the worksheet that a lot of people have been asking for. Maybe we can have a chance to dig deeper and look through that.
Very good. Thank you for the invite. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you. So yes, have a nice day, everybody. And thank you for attending this webinar. We'll have another webinar next week, so stay tuned.